help us understand how you got started in theology and what made you want to take the road toward being a theologian.
Yeah, well, in my 20s, I got married to an Anglican clergyman, so I became a curate's wife. I don't know if you use those terms here, but he
I don't
was
even know
kind
what
of
that means. Yeah.
trainee vicar, trainee minister in the Church of England. And so when I was 25, I was just praying about what I would do in church and the role that I would play.
Yeah.
Obviously, it was a different role because now I was married to one of the pastors. And out of the blue, I felt God calling me to a preaching ministry, which I wasn't really expecting. And so I ran that by my husband and his training vicar and the people that were around me, and they said yes. So there was a special place in the Church of England where you could train to have a preaching ministry without being ordained. And I felt that was the right thing for me. And I've never gone for ordination. I've always remained a lay person, which I thought was what God was calling me to. So I did this little training in my 20s to be a lay preacher, and then in my 30s was listening to my husband preaching and thinking, I really don't know enough to be preaching. So I thought that the kind of little training that I had was certainly not enough for me. So then I did a second degree in theology, and as I was doing that, I realized that actually theology was something I loved much more than a means to an end for ministry.
Yeah.
And so I did a master's in systematic theology, and there I met my supervisor who said that I should do a PhD, and I believed him, so I did one.
So you went for it.
I did.
Yeah. So what can I ask, if I may, what has it been like as a female in the theology world, which in my imagination is male dominated?
Yes, you've imagined correctly.
Yeah.
Yes. I didn't realize when I chose to do a master's in systematic theology that it was mainly men. And I remember getting my reading list and then looking through bibliographies and just seeing one man after another and thinking, gosh, that's unusual. I wonder why women don't do this. And I've never actually fathomed. I talk to my friends and colleagues, and we can't really quite work it out. But you're right, it's very male-dominated. I was prepared for that in my life. I have 3 brothers as well as 1 sister, and in the way that you can in England, I actually ended up going to a boys' boarding school where minority girls for the last 2 years. And I have 4 sons, so I like boys. I like the way they operate, and men are always still a little bit boys, so it's fine, really. But I would love to see more women in systematic theology, and it's something I work at with the other women I do know, those of us who are in systematic theology, and the men. The ones that I've worked with are wonderful, fantastic men, very supportive of women. That's why I can't quite work out why there don't seem to be a lot of us in it. But
yeah. Well, as your experience as a theologian and as a pastor, I'd love for you to summarize or help us summarize, what does it mean to follow Jesus? What does it mean to be a disciple of Christ?
Yeah, I think that, well, there's so many different facets to it, but if I was going to try and put it simply, the thing that I see in Jesus is this unfettered access to the Father in the power of the Spirit. And when he came to earth, one of the things, he came in order to die and to win our salvation and to win our forgiveness for us. But he also came to give us an example. So his life matters.
Right. And
so partly being a disciple is appropriating the salvation that he has won for us. But that's just the beginning. And I think sometimes we as evangelicals see that as the goal. Oh, well, I know I'm saved and then that's it. But actually the goal is for us to learn to live lives like he lived. And his relationship with the Father was so deep and so real. And he modeled that. He didn't have to. I mean, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are one, right?
Right.
So, but he came in the stuff that we're made of to show us what it could look like if you look like us in relationship to the Father. And I think that that's probably the heart of it, I would say, is learning to do that through him.
Yeah, no, I love the simplicity of that. But if I can say, I think Western Christianity has made discipleship into a lot of other things also. If I can ask you to critique some of the things that you see that Western Christianity might be doing incorrectly.
I think that, well, I suppose it depends on what kind of church you're looking at. So I think that within the evangelical tradition, discipleship can tend towards becoming legalistic. So we can tend to say, well, if you're ticking the right boxes, we're all okay with that. And if we can see you doing certain things, then we feel like that's okay. And that makes pastors feel secure.
Yeah.
But actually, one never quite knows what's going on underneath. So it's important for discipleship to be rooted in real relationships and honest relationships.
Yeah.
So that's one thing I would say is probably a bit of an issue in some circles. And then the opposite end of the spectrum is a view of God as a kind of, oh, he'll just love you whatever and unconditionally, which is absolutely true. But then you get this kind of, oh, I can just do what I want.
Right.
And that's not very healthy. And so that I would say that I probably see that side more in the kind of circles I move in, than people being bound up with a lot of legalism and ought to things.
Yeah. So somewhere in the middle, I think I'm hearing. So what does it look like for us to put appropriate effort in participating with God in our sanctification? Like God has saved us through Jesus in his Spirit, and that's something that we receive as a gift. But what kind of effort do we put in to participate with him in the act of sanctification?
Yeah. It's hard to know exactly what it's going to look like in each individual life, I think. But it will look like some kind of intentionality, some kind of decision making. So Paul does talk about making every effort. Jesus talks about making an effort. Peter talks about making an effort to walk in the ways of our salvation. And Paul talks about working out our salvation with fear and trembling. And I think we all know that we are creatures who have wills and who can, to some extent, shape things around us, although we always are being shaped by the forces around us. But and so we can take up this agency, this sense of actually I can do something to follow God better. And it's finding those things for ourselves and encouraging one another to say, what does it look like in your life? How are you doing it? And to make that something that's alive and vibrant and not something that's putting people under a weight of obligation. So that was really the thing that I wanted to try and communicate through my work. And
Yeah, no, I hear that. I'd love to hear maybe some of the ways that you try to actively obey God, some of the intentionality that you put into your life, just to help us understand what that might look like.
Right. So I suppose I got interested in this because I just don't feel very good. I don't feel like I know I'm not a good person, and I know that I don't look very much like Jesus at all. So I was sort of thinking, well, how can I help? How can I think about what this means when Jesus says, well, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect? And I thought, but I'm miles away from that. How am I ever going to even begin to think about being holy? And so I wanted to think about a theology of discipleship and look at the promises of God over our lives, that he is making us more like Jesus and that he has predestined us. So the only way that Paul uses the word predestination is to say you as a believer are predestined to be conformed to the likeness of the Son. So what God wills in your life will happen. That is predestination. And the promise we have as believers is that over our lives and through the presence of the Spirit that we will become more like Jesus, even if we don't feel it. So I think, okay, I have to believe it like I believe all the other promises of God, that He's working in my life. And then I wanted to root it in real lives. I thought,
Yeah.
well, there's no point in having a theology or a practice of discipleship that people can't relate to. So how do we work out what our real lives look like, and then how that relates to discipleship? And then my husband and I try and do that in our church, which is quite a small church, and I think probably discipleship only really works in smaller relational groups.
Yeah. Well, can I just say what I really appreciate about what you said is that sometimes we think the effort is not faith, but the intentionality in our effort, you said, is actually a faith and believing that God has predestined us and making us more into His likeness. So I love that. So thank you for saying that. I'm going to call a time out here. We're going to invite our worship team to lead us in a song. We're going to invite you guys to text in questions so that we can listen to Dr. Peppiatt's accent more. Okay. First question. Do you have any advice for females pursuing theology?
I would have a lot of advice if I had lots of time, but in a nutshell, I would say please do, because we need women pursuing theology.
Yeah.
But that sometimes, depending on your environment, it can feel a bit alienating. And there are certain hurdles that you may have to overcome. So you might have to kind of brace yourself for some perseverance.
Yeah.
And I would surround yourself with supporters, with people who will help you, pray for you, encourage you, and keep you in there.
All right, thank you. Here's another question. How can I encourage women as a male Bible student to jump into theology with confidence?
Oh, I love that question. Thank you. I think that for one of the things that's important is that we all learn to read the Bible as a group of texts that is for women.
Yeah.
And that's why I wrote my book, Rediscovering Scripture's Vision for Women, because I had been influenced really by people who believed that the Bible speaks positive words over women without reservation. And so I wanted to bring that out, and the men can engage in that in the same way. They can appropriate that, so not make the message for women a women's message for women, but for the men to take that up. So somebody like Scott McKnight, who's a friend of mine, he models that. And if you want to be someone like that, that would be wonderful. You'll change the world.
I love that. Here's another question. I have often heard that the UK is a very hostile environment for Christianity. Has that been your experience? And if so, what has it been like navigating that environment?
I think it is different from here, and because of our legacy of the Enlightenment and how European history of ideas has developed, Christianity has been marginalized, and definitely the church in some ways. It can be undermining, and at school, people can feel. My kids went to a school and had no Christian friends in their school. They had friends, got people that they got on well with, but not other believers. So that forges you in a particular way. I would have said the same. I had no Christian friends, particularly at school, or really university. So it's a different environment, and yes, there is sometimes some hostility. I would say it's more apathy. It's more people not really caring that you can have conversations, and then people are like, "Oh, well, that's fine for you, well done, nice," but they're not interested. So, but the younger generation, my children's age, 20s, I think there's an awakening and a freshness coming, and people are being more open to talking about God. And there's a lot of street evangelism that goes on now, and it's forced the church to be creative, to be prayerful, to be resilient.
Yeah.
And actually, I think it's taught us, in a sense, a better way of being Christians, because we're not complacent and comfortable in some ways.
Great, thank you. Can I ask you something following up with that? It's like if you're at the market and you tell people, or you meet someone for the first time and you say, hey, I'm a theologian, what do they say to you?
They say, geology.
Geology?
Yeah.
Okay.
They don't quite hear, they're like, and they go, theology. And then they say, what's that?
Got it.
And I say, oh, it's the study of Christian religion. And then they say, is that like any religion? And I say, well, I study Christian religion, so theology really is Christian theology.
Yeah.
And then I try and explain to them the difference between religious studies and theology.
Yeah.
And then we often have good conversations. I mean, people are generally quite interested.
Yeah.
Yeah, but no, it's not. They don't know. There's a lot of ignorance in the UK about the Bible story and the Bible narrative, and who Jesus actually was, and yeah.
Great. Okay, thank you. Here's another question. Does Jesus have a British accent in your head?
I just think he has one anyway, doesn't he?
Maybe Middle Eastern, but okay, yeah. I don't know. Okay.
Yeah, yes.
Okay, here's another question. Okay. Who is one of the most influential theologians in your life?
I have such a collection of, most of them are dead. And
but they live on through their books and their work. Yeah.
So of the older theologians, I love Athanasius and Cyril of Alexandria. I think they gave us breakthroughs in terms of how we understand the incarnation. Paul, going back, I think of Paul as a theologian. He's one of my favorite people. And then John Owen is someone who's influenced me a lot, and a woman who's very little known called Catherine Bushnell, who wouldn't have called herself a theologian, and I think she was. And then in the modern day, I really like Professor Ian McFarlane's work. He's at Cambridge.
Okay, thank you. Here's another question. What are some practical things a believer should do to work out their salvation, but not fall into legalism and self-dependency?
Good question. I think that it's important to understand our devotional lives as something that is living and will change. So my life has been very disrupted. I'm a woman, I'm a mother, so I haven't really had the luxury of having patterns for years. And so I have to be creative, and I have to think of, and that actually does break legalism, because you literally can't say, oh, today I'm going to tick off all these things that I'm doing, because something will throw a spanner in the works, and then you can't. So so don't worry about disruption. Disruption can be a nice sort of tool that God uses to say, hey, remember, this is about me and you, and not about you ticking your list off. So that's good. And I think small groups, really discipleship should be done with other people. And I would like to see us breaking, you asked about critiquing our traditions. And one of the things that in the West and in Protestantism is we've made our spiritual lives are individualistic. So it's like, it's me and Jesus, and how am I doing with him? Right. And actually that's very alien to the culture that Christianity is rooted in, and I think that was deliberate on God's part, that it's meant to be communal, it's meant to be in community, it's meant to be, I know how you are, and you know how I am, and then that kind of prevents us, if we're being fully honest, it prevents us from becoming that kind of person.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to hear, just to follow up with that, I'd love to hear some of the spiritual disciplines that you engage in to make sure that you're centering on a relationship with God.
Yeah, I guess my sort of go-to ones, and it's important to disrupt your own preferences as well, but mine would be prayer and reading the Bible, which for me is a kind of non-negotiable of things that I really, I can't say that I have read the Bible every day, since I made a commitment to Jesus. But if I have times when I haven't done it, I'll then set aside a long time to sit down and maybe read a whole book.
Yeah.
Or so I make sure that there's always that time in my life when I'm engaging with scripture and prayer every day. I wouldn't go through a day without praying. And then the other ones for me would be fasting and feasting. So fasting, I think, is the most wonderful gift from God to complement our prayer. And I think that we should all learn how to do it, and encourage one another to do that. And then, but also have the feasting, the community, the fun, the parties. I think Jesus loved parties. So.
Yeah, I love that. And we don't do that very well. We do things, but we don't do it well,
Yeah.
I think. Okay, here's another question. When studying theology, how did you separate your personal devotion from the courses you were taking?
I didn't.
Yeah.
I don't think.
Tell us, unpack that for
yeah,
us.
So I only started studying theology because I wanted to become a better preacher and a better pastor and a better person, I suppose.
Yeah.
And so when I started my studies, I prayed through them, and then when I got the chance to be a bit more independent, obviously doing a research master's and then a research PhD, I prayed about everything, and I would say to God, what shall I do? Even books that I would read, because I did everything part-time, so my time was so limited, and I would kind of do it in dialogue with God and say, shall I do this or shall I do that? Or, so, and I pray about my courses that I teach, and I pray for my students, and I see my role as a theological educator as my vocation. So
Yeah, great. Thank you. Here's another question. Do you think we should have smaller churches instead of bigger churches if discipleship happens in smaller groups?
I think bigger churches should always have small groups. We're part of a small church, so I like small churches, and I'm really hoping that God doesn't make us go to a big church. But if He does, I'll go. And so we'll work on the kind of multiplication model. But big churches can be wonderful, and actually, I think the younger you are, the more important it is to see visibly that you're part of something really big. And I would say that certainly in Europe, because it can feel so isolating. So when you walk into a big auditorium or a big church and it's full of people worshipping, that's wonderful. And I wouldn't want to diminish that in any way.
Yeah.
So I think big church has its place and can be really encouraging. But there has to be a small group system.
Yeah, I love that. Great. Here's another question. Did your relationship with your husband, friends, family change because of your call to higher education and ministry?
I suppose you would have to ask them in some ways. I've been very fortunate having a husband who was really supportive and excited about what God was calling me into.
Yeah.
So that was wonderful. So we had no tension between us over that. And also a husband who, when I was ready for a full-time job and to step into my first career, really, in my 40s, was happy to make the adjustments so that I could do that. And my youngest son, who was still at home, was also happy to do that, although he was slightly worried about what they were going to eat. I did all the cooking.
There you go. There you go. Hot Pockets. Okay. All right. What would you say are the 3 most important aspects of discipleship?
I would say the 3 most important aspects are love God, love yourself, and love your neighbor.
Okay, we'll leave it at that. All right. We're just going to let that sit. Okay, here we go. There's another question. There seems to be a decline in Christianity in the US and the UK among college-age students. What are some steps we could take to try and disciple our peers?
Yeah. great question. And it's something that my husband and I, 15 years ago, we had a student ministry, which we weren't particularly looking for. We moved to plant a church, and we thought we were going to have a family ministry because our kids were, we had this big family of 4 kids. And God kind of redirected us to have a student ministry. And it was very fulfilling and wonderful. And the thing that I noticed most was that people of that age group need investment in their lives. They need to be listened to, and they need not to be fobbed off with simplistic answers. So one of the things that I think works well is to have groups where people can genuinely ask genuine questions and not be told that this is the simple answer and you just have to get on board with that. So people will become Christians if they're listened to, and if they understand that actually they're following people who have integrity and have thought those things through and will share their lives with them, I think.
Yeah, great. Well, we always end this chapel by asking this question. So what are some of the biblical principles or passages that have influenced your thinking about our topic today?
I think that John's gospel is a very important gospel for me. And I read it and reread it a lot. So my husband loves Matthew's gospel. And he loves the whole Bible, and and so do I. But so we tend to sort of gravitate, I would say John's gospel and the Psalms are texts that I go back to over and over again. But Romans 8, 14 to 17 has been very important for me. This idea that we are called into a relationship with God as his children, no longer to be slaves to fear. And I have found myself going back to this idea of what it means to be adopted as a child of God, and that God's purpose and will for us is that fear will be eliminated from our lives. And I ponder this thing of what would it be like to be the most secure person on the planet, because that's who Jesus was. He had absolutely no fear. And when you think of how fear becomes a driver that destroys lives and relationships, I can see that that's where God wants to get right into those and deliver us from those. And that's one of my passages.
Discover who you're called to be at Biola University, a leading Christ-centered university in Los Angeles, with programs on campus and online. Subscribe for more of our videos and learn more at biola.edu.